All right, good evening. Welcome to LaRouche PAC's Saturday class series. It's December 3rd, and I'm Susan Kokinda. Tonight, Bob Ingram is going to be concluding what has been an extraordinary journey into the life and singular role which George Washington played in the formation of this republic. I encourage people to go to the LaRouche PAC website and review the entire class series, which began with Washington's military accomplishments and has now taken us up to the point of his administration and the indispensable role which his two administrations played in forging something absolutely new on this planet. I want to turn it over to Bob very quickly because he has a lot to present, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions and answers. But I just want to very, very briefly locate it in the crisis that is gripping our nation right now. There is a lot of soul-searching reevaluation, especially among the America First Trump layers, as we came out of the November 2022 midterm elections. Everyone is committed to saving our republic, but I think many right now are grappling with what are the actual policies? What is the strategy which we have to adopt in order to be able to restore, rebuild, and ensure that our republic lasts into the future? And those policy questions can only be answered if we are very clear, very firmly grounded in what the principles were which laid the basis for the creation, the establishment, and the propagation of our great republic. And what Bob has developed in the course of this class series, I think, has shown a brand new light on how to look at and think about those principles through the extraordinary actions of George Washington. So I am going to turn it right over to Bob, and go ahead.
Hi, folks. So as Susan said, this is the concluding class in this 10-part series. And just a couple of things. One is that some of you have probably been with us here from the beginning. Others, maybe this is the first one, or maybe you've seen a couple of them. But they are all available, all 10 of these classes after tonight. They will be available on the LaRouche PAC website, larouchepac.com. So if you are so inclined, you can go back and look at some of the earlier ones. Last week, I went through a sort of a chronology of the battle that took place in the Washington administration. I went through it year by year, in conjunction with or parallel to the events that were unfolding in France during the French Revolution. I'm not going to take up that chronology tonight. I am going to begin with, we left off last week with 1795. And I am going to begin this week to just try to situate things in 1796. But then the rest of the class is going to be more on sort of an overview, or looking at the substance of the Washington administration as a whole, and, what George Washington accomplished, what he left to us in terms of the American Republic. I will say that one of the difficulties of this class is I'm going to be reading a lot, and I try to avoid doing that because sometimes it's hard to follow someone who's reading. But there's no way around it because I want to give people a sense of a variety of things, and so I'm going to be reading from certain things that were written at that time. So to just jump right into it, by the time you get to 1796, which is Washington's last year in office, the crisis in the country was profound. It had year by year, it had worsened. The political crisis, not the economic crisis, but the political crisis had reached a point of really reached the breaking point, and other things were operating as well. For example, a lot of people don't think about this, but during the second term of Washington's, Indian attacks on the frontier had escalated dramatically. And this wasn't just Indians, uprising against the settlers. These were attacks that were paid for, that were funded by the European monarchies. In the South, the Spanish government, which controlled Florida, had financed and paid a variety of Indian tribes to attack American settlers all the way from the Florida border all the way up to Kentucky, the Carolinas, Western Georgia, etc. Slaughtering American settlers who were, coming into those areas. This was literally paid for by the Spanish government. And in the Northwest, the same thing was going on, where the British were paying the warriors from or chieftains from the Six Nations and other tribes to attack American settlers moving into the Ohio territory. In the case of the British, they were actually paying these Indians so much per scalp of each settler that they could kill and scalp. And this had reached a very, very dramatic point during the second administration of Washington. Meanwhile, the attacks on Washington and Hamilton not only ended with the defeat of the Whiskey Rebellion, but they kept escalating, dramatically. And one of the things that occurred was that in the first Washington administration, most of the attacks coming out from these Jeffersonian newspapers, these vicious attacks, were targeted against Hamilton, and to a certain extent some others like Gouverneur Morris and a couple of other people, but most of it was focused on Hamilton. That all changed in Washington's second administration, where the attacks, they continued against Hamilton, but they began to focus more and more on Washington personally. Excuse me. And I went through some of that last week, and I'm not going to repeat it. Washington, denounced these attacks as what he called outrages on common decency, unquote. And I want to give you one sense of, Jefferson's thinking as we move into 1796. Now, Jefferson is no longer in the government. He's running this operation out of his, plantation at Monticello. But in 1796, he wrote a lengthy letter to a man named Philip Mazzei, who was really a European aristocrat who had moved to Virginia at one point and owned a plantation, adjoining Jefferson's plantation, and they became very close friends. And then Mazzei moved back to Europe. And in 1796, he was living in Pisa in Italy, or Pisa, however you pronounce it. And and Jefferson wrote him a letter. And I'll read you a short excerpt from that letter. He says, quote, "Our political situation is prodigiously changed since you left us. Instead of that noble love of liberty and that republican government which carried us triumphantly through the dangers of war, an Anglo-monarchico-aristocratic party has arisen. Their avowed object is to impose on us the substance, as they have already given us the form, of the British government. We have against us the executive power and the judiciary power." Now, I'm going to stop right there because it is important. I did go through this a little bit before, but it is important to understand that one of the primary objections that Jefferson had to the Constitution was the establishment of a strong, independent executive and a strong, independent judiciary. He wanted both of these branches to really be under the control of the legislature, and particularly the executive. But as time went on, the judiciary became a major objection as well. And he says that directly in this letter. So I'll continue. "We have against us the executive power and the judiciary power, all the officers of the government, the British merchants, and the Americans who trade on British capital, the speculators, persons interested in the bank and the public funds. I should give you a fever if I should name the apostates who have embraced these heresies, men who were Solomons in council and Samsons in combat, but whose hair has been cut off by the whore England." So that's Jefferson in 1796. And, to just repeat and reemphasize what I have gone through before, Jefferson is absolutely committed to overthrowing the United States Constitution as it was ratified and put into operation by the Washington administration. So that's the political climate in 1796. Now, before I proceed, I want to just say a few things about, sort of what Washington did, what he accomplished personally. Because if you look, as I said last week, when Washington was sworn into office in April of 1789, and faced with, a situation where really the Constitution only existed on paper, but it was not operational, what he had to do was to create the republic, not the republic on paper, but to create, the physical reality of the republic, to create the republic in action. He had to create it out of the blue. It had never been done before. No one had ever attempted this. No one had ever had the opportunity to attempt this. So, as he said himself in a conversation with one person, he said, "I walk on untrodden ground." And through his actions and his decisions, he had to create something which had never before existed in human history. And he did that. And, there are certain technical things he did, which are really not the most important, but they're worth noting. He established executive authority over foreign policy, particularly with the Neutrality Proclamation. You know, he made the first use of the presidential veto. He created the cabinet. The cabinet is not in the Constitution, and he created the cabinet system. He established the precedent of setting the legislative agenda, and he repeatedly and forcefully used the full power of the presidency as defined in the Constitution, particularly in the implied powers of the necessary and proper clause, the general welfare clause. He established the full authority of the presidency to act on behalf of the people of the United States. And it's worth reminding people here, even with the Electoral College, the president of the United States, with the intervening of the Electoral College, the president of the United States is the only federal, office, well, let's put it this way. It's an office with, it's not the only office, but it's an, unlike the U.S. Senate, which was, elected by the state legislatures, and unlike other things, it is an office, as Gouverneur Morris emphasized at the Constitutional Convention. Well, it's the only office, really. The House of Representatives is represented by congressional districts. So you could say they're elected by the people, but only their particular congressional districts. The president is the only office in the country which is elected by the people as a whole. The American citizenry as a whole elects the president. And as Gouverneur Morris stressed at the Constitutional Convention, the president is the sort of supreme representative of the American people as the whole. Congressmen are responsible to the voters of their district. The president is the only office in which the elected official is responsible to the entirety of the American people. And Washington acted repeatedly and forcefully on behalf of the American people, particularly, as we've gone through in previous classes, in the realm of economic policy, but not just economic policy, as important as that is. The way one historian put it is that Washington transformed the impossible into the inevitable. And that's really true. And you could say the same thing about his military career, where what he was confronted with as the British landed their troops in Brooklyn, outnumbering Washington and outgunning Washington, he transformed the impossible into what became the inevitable. And now, this may not seem that important, but it's to just, again, to sort of address the question of Washington's character. Most people are not aware of the fact that Washington almost died twice while he was in office, while he was serving as president. The first time was in June of 1789, when he had only been in office a few days, when he developed a very large tumor on his thigh, on his leg, on his left thigh. And it took, they had to remove it with surgery. They had to cut it out. And there was severe blood loss. And for quite a few days, he was in critical condition, and it was uncertain whether he was going to live or not. That was in June of 1789. And then about a year later, in May of 1790, he collapsed on the floor from influenza, a very severe case of influenza. And he lingered near death, very close to death for 3 days, and with pulmonary complications. And it was very uncertain for a period of time whether he was going to live or not. Now, these two medical attacks, or conditions he had, affected him permanently and severely. And Washington confessed later that the two illnesses, particularly the influenza, had so permanently damaged his health that he feared that if there was another attack, a third attack, that he would, quote, this is the way he put it, I would be, quote, it would put me to sleep with my fathers, unquote. So, this is what, and this is obviously in a case when we don't have the modern medicine we have today. And, but Washington, stayed in office. He persevered. And I will remind people here, that Washington was a reluctant president. And, it was not feigned reluctance, like, I'm going to act coy and ask you to convince me. He really was not eager to become president of the United States. And it was only in 1788, repeated letters and also personal visits, entreaties from Hamilton, from Gouverneur Morris, from John Jay, from Henry Lee, Light Horse Harry Lee, and others who they put enormous pressure on Washington to accept the presidency in 1788. And he finally agreed to do it because they convinced him that there was, no one else who could lead the nation. And then again, it's not generally widely known, but that in 1792, Washington was determined to retire after his first term. Don't forget, this is after these two illnesses, among other things, in which he had nearly died twice. He was determined to retire from the presidency. And again, some of these same individuals, particularly Hamilton, intervened and more or less begged him not to retire. And what Hamilton said to him, and maybe others said the same thing, but I know Hamilton said it to him. This is after this is Jefferson and Madison are organizing an insurrection in the country, and states are being pulled apart. What Hamilton said to him is that if you retire now in 1792, the Union is likely to dissolve, that the Republic is likely to break apart and will not survive. And Washington, took that to heart. So he accepted a second term. And then in the second term, as I've already mentioned, he becomes the target of Jefferson, of Madison, of all of the democratic societies. And he is subjected to treatment, as bad, or, in my view, far worse than what Donald Trump was subjected to. But he did it. He did it out of his love for the nation, for the Republic, and his awareness that if he didn't do it, no one else would. No one else could, even if they wanted to. So he did that. I want to look a little bit at just sort of the outline, and I'll get back to this later when I talk a little more about economic policy, but a little of the outline of what Washington accomplished. The one is the unifying of the country, unification of the country. And, this was no small accomplishment. It's not something you should shrug off. Bear in mind that up until the ratification of the Constitution in late 1788, and really, frankly, up until Washington's inauguration in April of 1789, all of the 13 states, previously 13 colonies, but now 13 states, they all considered themselves sovereign nations. Their participation in the Articles of Confederation did not change that. This was a confederation of sovereign states, and they viewed themselves as independent states. And Washington had to forge that into one nation and assert, national authority over the government, which now this was not just a question of laws. He had to change the culture of the nation, or at least begin to change the culture of the nation. He had to get people to start thinking of themselves as Americans, as opposed to Virginians, or New Yorkers, or Pennsylvanians, or South Carolinians. He had to begin to get people to start thinking of themselves as Americans. Now, one of the things he did in that regard is that after he had been in office for about 6 months, so he did this, right away in his first term, he launched 2 tours of the nation in which he visited every single state. The first was a tour of the North. It lasted a couple of months. He toured New England, the Middle Atlantic states, etc. He visited more than 60 cities, towns, and hamlets. So he didn't just visit the big cities, like Philadelphia and New York or Pennsylvania, or even the medium-sized cities, in some of these states. He went to small towns. He went to hamlets, which only had a couple of hundred people, he traveled, across all of New England and the Middle Atlantic states, giving speeches, holding dinners, public events. For instance, when he had to go back to New England because in his first tour of New England, he did not visit Rhode Island because Rhode Island had not yet ratified the Constitution. But then later, about a year later, after Rhode Island ratified the Constitution, he went back to Rhode Island. And one of the places he spoke in Rhode Island was at a synagogue. And he gave perhaps one of the strongest speeches given at that time, in those years, in defense of religious liberty. A very strong speech in defense of freedom of worship, in the United States. Then, about 6 months later, in March of 1790, Washington embarked on a southern tour. And this was far more arduous, because if you just think of the distances involved, and also the roads in the South were horrendous. And most of this was done overland, not by ship. And this was a round trip because he traveled all the way down to Georgia. He visited every state. And again, he visited cities, towns, hamlets, rural hamlets. And the round trip was over 2,000 miles of very hard traveling, and it lasted several months. But he spoke everywhere. Small groups of people, large crowds of people, banquets, dinners, public speeches at city halls, and again, if you look at these two trips taken as a whole, between the New England tour and the Southern tour. I don't know what the total number of speeches Washington gave or the total number of communities he visited, but it was at least 125, 150, maybe more, of different towns and villages and cities that he visited. In other words, he went into the nooks and crannies of the country, speaking in front of wealthy people and dirt poor people. And his message to all of them was, you are now an American citizen. You are now a citizen of the American Republic. This is a new era. So, this was quite something that he did. I mean, the second major accomplishment, which I went through last week, is that the devastating economic crisis and the catastrophe facing the nation in 1789 had been completely overcome with the initiatives of Alexander Hamilton. The debt had been funded, a national currency had been established, the nation had been made creditworthy, and then through the National Bank, the public credit system had been put into operation, and I'll go through more of that a little later. And then, the final thing was that I'll mention right now is the establishment of an independent, strong presidency, a strong executive, and the establishment of an independent judiciary. None of which it was clear when Washington took office that this is what was going to be done. It didn't just happen. And it was opposed in both regards by Jefferson and Madison. And remember, Madison is leading the opposition to Washington in the US Congress and trying to stop these things. For example, I'll give you one example. After the Washington signed the Jay Treaty with Great Britain, which Madison tried to defeat in Congress, but after it went through, Robert Livingston, who was a congressman from New York, who was a close ally of Jefferson's, launched an investigation, one of these congressional investigations into the Jay Treaty, with charges that were leveled that there was corruption involved, there was, hanky-panky. And one of the things he demanded was that Washington hand over to a congressional committee all of the documents relating to the Jay Treaty, so that Congress could examine these documents and decide whether any crimes had been committed. And Washington flat out refused and said, we do not come under legislative jurisdiction. You have no constitutional authority to demand these papers from us, and we are not going to hand them over, thus establishing the first precedent, the very first precedent that the executive does not come under congressional jurisdiction, that it is independent of the U.S. Congress and has its own constitutional authority. So Washington did that. And then in terms of the judiciary power, this went much further later with John Marshall, but it was really established by the Jay Court, John Jay, who was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, at least for a few years, and Jay established the principle of judicial review of state laws by the Supreme Court. He established that the Supreme Court was independent of Congress, They set up branches of the Supreme Court, federal courts in every state, or mostly every state, most states in the country. And then later, obviously, when John Marshall became, this is after Washington left office, when John Marshall became the Chief Justice with McCulloch versus Maryland, he did two things. One is he declared the national bank to be constitutional, but also he established the authority of the Supreme Court to rule on the constitutionality of laws passed by the US Congress. And I would remind people here that after, Alexander Hamilton, maybe Gouverneur Morris, I don't know, but after Alexander Hamilton, there was no one, associated with the Washington administration who was more loyal to Washington than John Marshall. Now, he was a young man during Washington's presidency, and he did not have a major post in Washington's presidency, but he was a soldier at Valley Forge with Washington, and he idolized Washington. He wrote the first biography of Washington. The 5-volume Life of Washington was written by John Marshall, and under the Marshall, when Marshall became the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, he established the full authority of the Supreme Court, as it had been envisioned by Washington and others. So now what I want to do, maybe I won't read a couple of these things. I was going to read Washington's Proclamation of Neutrality and Hamilton's defense of the Proclamation of Neutrality, but I do want to leave more time for discussion than we had in last week's class. So I think I will just skip to Washington's farewell address, as important as the Proclamation of Neutrality is. But I'll skip to Washington's farewell address. It was, to a certain extent, it really was written by Washington himself. You could say it was co-authored by Hamilton. Hamilton certainly had a lot of input into it. And also John Jay's advice was solicited, and John Jay had a certain amount of input into it. But Washington really wrote it himself. And it's called his farewell address. But it was not an address that he gave as a speech, and it was not delivered to the United States Congress. It was written as an open letter to the American people, and it was published in written form, not oral form. It was published in the American Daily Advertiser on September 19th, 1796, as Washington's second term is drawing to a close. But then it was reprinted all over the country, in newspapers all over the country. And the way in which it was done, as I said, it was not written as an address to Congress. It was written in a way and published in a way to reach the largest number of American citizens, the largest number of people in the nation. And, and it's written in the midst of this uprising by Jefferson and his allies against the Washington administration. So it is written, in one sense, for all time, to put forward certain principles of the Republic for future generations. But it's also written, to address the situation that exists in the country at the time that it was published. So people, I encourage people to read the entirety of it. Really, it's a very good document, a great document. But I'm just going to read you a couple of short excerpts from it. And Washington says, quote, "All obstructions to the execution of the laws, all combinations and associations under whatever plausible character, with the real design to direct, control, counteract, or awe the regular deliberation and action of the constituted authorities, are destructive of the fundamental principle and of fatal tendency. Now, he's speaking here, in case it's not clear, about Jefferson's democratic societies. He says, they serve to organize faction, to give it an artificial and extraordinary force, to put in the place of the delegated will of the nation, the will of a party, often a small but artful and enterprising minority of the community. And according to the alternative triumphs of different parties, to make the public administration the mirror of the ill-concerted and incongruous projects of a particular faction, rather than the organ of consistent and wholesome plans digested by the common councils and modified by mutual interests. However, combinations or associations of the above description may now and then answer popular ends, they are likely, in the course of time and things, to become potent engines by which cunning, ambitions, and unprincipled men will be enabled to subvert the power of the people and to usurp for themselves the reins of government, destroying afterwards the very engines which had lifted themselves to unjust dominion. And then skipping a lot, he says, without looking forward to an extremity of this kind, the common and continual mischiefs of the spirit of party are sufficient to make it the interest and duty of a wise people to discourage and restrain it. It serves always to distract the public councils and enfeeble the public administration. It agitates the community with ill-founded jealousies and false alarms, kindles the animosity of one part against another, foments occasionally riot and destruction. And before continuing, I'll just make a point here. If you read these idiotic biographies or histories of this period, and if you read the way people talk about Washington's farewell address, what they say is Washington is warning against faction. Washington is warning against political factions. I mean, that's just completely untrue. That's not what he's doing here. I mean, don't forget, 1 year earlier, Washington had got on a horse and rode in command of a 15,000-man army to put down the Whiskey Rebellion. He has issued denunciations of Jefferson. He has stated publicly that the democratic societies led by the friends of Jefferson and Madison had organized the Whiskey Rebellion. He is not warning against factions. Jefferson has a faction, Washington has Hamilton has a faction. That is not what he's doing. He is attacking the faction of Jefferson and Madison, who are trying to overthrow the Constitution, overthrow the principles of the Republic. That's what he's doing here. And anyone who says differently is an idiot or a liar. You just have to look at what was going on during this period. So anyway, after go through some of that, Washington goes on to say, I shall carry it with me to my grave as a strong incitement to unceasing vows that heaven may continue to you the choicest tokens of its beneficence, that your union and brotherly affection may be perpetual. He's talking to the American people. That the free Constitution, which is the work of your hands, may be sacredly maintained. That its administration in every department may be stamped with wisdom and virtue, that in fine, the happiness of the people of these states under the auspices of liberty may be made complete by so careful a preservation and so prudent a use of this blessing as will acquire to them the glory of recommending it to the applause, the affection, and the adoption of every nation which is yet a stranger to it. That the principles of the Republic shall endure, and that it shall inspire people all over the world and nations all over the world to adopt the principles of this republic. That's what Washington is saying. Now, I will tell you that upon the issuance of the farewell address, it is unbelievably attacked in the Jeffersonian press. And I'll just read you one, 4-word quote. The Aurora in Philadelphia, which is the leading mouthpiece together with the other one, but in some ways it is the leading mouthpiece of the democratic societies. The Aurora ran a blistering attack, an editorial on the farewell address, in which they called it, quote, the loathings of a sick mind. The loathings of a sick mind. So that is how Jefferson's friends in the media and in the Democratic Society describe Washington's farewell address. And I'll just return a little bit to I will say that there was one final thing Washington did, one final speech he gave before he left office after the farewell address. In December of 1796, he made his final address to Congress. Again, he warns very strongly against the attacks on the government, the attacks on the Constitution, the attacks on the principles of the Constitution. But then he goes through, the accomplishments of the administration, and he describes the Jay Treaty, through which the British had, given up all of their forts, and through they had recognized U.S. sovereignty over the Ohio Territory. They had the commercial, the advantages of the treaty, which had led to an explosion of U.S. trade, U.S. commerce, U.S. exports. He goes through that the border disputes with Britain in Maine and with Spain in Florida had been resolved. He goes through that new treaties had been signed with the Indians, with the Creeks and others, in which the warfare on the borders had been not completely ended, but a lot of it had been resolved. He goes through that as a result of Hamilton's policies, the nation was secure financially, that there was that the economy by 1796 was booming, manufacturing was growing, agriculture was growing, that they had created a navy. I didn't mean to say that. And there was a massive expansion of manufacturing under the Washington administration. The first textile mill in the country was opened in 1790. The first canal was opened in 1795. This was the South Hadley Canal in Massachusetts, which began construction in 1792 and opened in 1795, opening the era of canal building. This happened under the Washington administration. There was a dramatic increase. It didn't start with Washington, but there was a dramatic increase in iron manufacturing, including blast furnaces and others. And there was all kinds of things. The beginning of the construction of turnpikes begins under the Washington administration. And this is all a product, however it's financed, whether states are financing it, whether it's financed privately. Nevertheless, this is all a product of the rescuing of the U.S. Financial system and the public credit system, which is initiated through the National Bank. So Washington goes through all this in his final address to the Congress. And then Washington retires, and and he only lives a few more years. And during that time, there are really two things which he is paying close attention to. One is, he's now back at Mount Vernon, and he is devoting a lot of time, as I went through a couple of months ago, into the modernization and expansion of the agriculture of Mount Vernon, technologically progressive agriculture, bringing new technology online, the wheat production, and other things. He devotes a lot of time to bringing to the scientific agriculture that he is implementing in Mount Vernon. Otherwise, politically, now that he is sort of free of being the president and he is a private individual, he is, if anything, more blunt, more forthright in his attacks on Jefferson and Madison and on what they're doing. And in one letter he says, look, what I believe is that all of this glorification of France, that we love France, we're for the French Revolution. He says, certainly to a certain extent, a lot of their followers believe this. But he said, what I suspect is that really it's a ploy, that Jefferson and Madison and their friends are, using this to whip up, violence and to whip up revolutionary fervor in the population. But in one letter he says, he says, I believe that their purported, this is a quote, their purported affection for France is a disingenuous ploy, and that they have no more regard for France than they do for the Grand Turk. That what he says is that they are using this as a means of building up a political violence and fervor and an insurgency in the United States to overthrow the policies and principles of the Washington administration. That is what their intention is. And he writes a whole series of letters. In 1798, in the last letter that he writes to Lafayette, and I don't know how much Lafayette got out of this, but in the last letter he writes to Lafayette, he says, quote, this is Washington writing to Lafayette, he says, a party exists in the United States formed by a combination of causes who oppose the government in all of its measures and are determined to change the nature of it and to subvert the Constitution. So that's Washington to Lafayette in 1798. And there's in one letter, he gives a description of Jefferson, which it's a letter, a private letter he writes, in which he says that Thomas Jefferson, quote, is one of the most artful, intriguing, industrious, and double-faced politicians in America. So that's how he describes Jefferson in about 1798 or 1799. And he wouldn't even speak Madison's words once he went back to name after he went back to Mount Vernon. So look, oh man, I am going to go a little late. Sorry, folks, but what I want to do very quickly. It'll take a few minutes, but I want to read you a couple of things that people wrote about Washington, and the the first one is from a man named Thomas Starr King, and that's how we'll conclude this. And Thomas Starr King, for those who have never heard of him, was a Unitarian minister who lived at the time of the Civil War. So we're talking about decades later. But he came to California, and during the Civil War, when the Civil War broke out, 1861, 1862, he played an extremely important role in keeping California in the Union. He was devoted to Lincoln, and for those who don't know it, in 1861, California came very close to seceding from the Union. There was a very powerful force in California which wanted California to join the Confederacy, and there were others who wanted California to secede and become an independent state, independent country. And they came very close to doing it. And Thomas Starr King toured the state, gave speeches, intervened, rallied people, and he played a critical role in keeping California in the Union. And in 1864, he wrote an essay entitled "Washington or Greatness," and the essay is about the greatness of George Washington. And if you can just put up that first picture, Susan. Yeah, now you can't see Thomas Starr King here because he's standing on the stage where the banners are, and so you can't distinguish him. But he's speaking here at a rally in downtown San Francisco, and this is either 1861 or 1862, and you probably can't read the banner, but I'm going to read to you what's on the two big banners, and there are several smaller banners. But the banner which on top reads, "The Union, the whole Union, and nothing but the Union." And the banner that's on the bottom reads, "Liberty and Union, now and forever, one and inseparable." So this is Thomas Starr King speaking at this rally at the beginning of the Civil War, trying to save the Union. So I'll read you a couple of paragraphs from the essay he wrote, "Washington or Greatness." And it goes, "Washington was greater than Napoleon or Alexander by that rule of his spirit that made him refuse such distinction as theirs. If the temptation to be a despot conquered the genius of Bonaparte, it was conquered by the soul of Washington. Try to think of any other man connected with the armies or the councils of our revolution taking Washington's place and he performing a subordinate part. We cannot do it. He was the man fitted and made to uphold the banner of liberty on a continent in the colossal nature representing in his own inward rule and repose of the greatness of a nation rising up to proclaim and illustrate liberty founded on law. The man to whom a whole country looked for support and on whose inward resources they relied in war and peace, has not been overrated for greatness. Nay, has not been wisely and enough estimated as yet. Let us bless God for George Washington. If any man cannot see our indebtedness for his service by looking at the past, then let him turn toward Europe today and study what each oppressed and bleeding land is suffering in the spasmodic throes of its strength and despair. It has no such man as he to comprehend the justice of its cause in his brain and the sentiments of it in his breast, and to excite in every thinker and in every man, in every lover of God, and in the cottages of every village, a trust in the clearness of his sight and the purity of its heart, the soundness of his judgment, and the republicanism of his sword. When there shall be fewer metaphysical declaimers and atheistic brigands in the ranks of the leaders of the popular cause in Europe, and a few men, yes, even one large and well-poised nature, to whom manliness and piety may look up without fear and without shame the prospects of liberty, the prospects of liberty will not be so dark as they are now. And I could read more, but I will. I appreciate the sort of attack on the metaphysical declaimers and atheistic brigands. I think that sort of echoes back to our discussion of the French Revolution. So I'm going to read you a couple more things. It'll take a little time, but let's do it. If you can, the next one is a eulogy, which was delivered, I think, only weeks after Washington's death in December of 1799. But Washington had just died, and a eulogy was delivered by this man, who is Richard Allen, Bishop Richard Allen. He was the founder of the African Methodist Episcopal Church in America. And I believe he was a former slave, now free. And I believe he was the first leader of an independent Black church in the United States, in the city of Philadelphia. And on December 29th, after Washington passed, he delivered a eulogy to Washington. And I'll read you a few paragraphs out of that. He says, "At this time, it may not be improper to speak a little on the late mournful event, an event in which we participate in common with the feelings of a grateful people, an event which causes the land to mourn in a season of festivity. Our father and our friend is taken from us. He whom the nation honors is seen of men no more. We, my friends, have particular cause to bemoan our loss. To us, he has been the sympathizing friend and tending father. He has watched over us and viewed our degraded and afflicted state with compassion and pity. His heart was not insensible to our sufferings. He whose wisdom the nations revered thought we had a right to liberty, unbiased by the popular opinion of the state in which is the memorable Mount Vernon. He dared to do his duty and wipe off the only stain which men could ever reproach him. And is now said by authority on which I rely, that he who ventured his life in battles, whose head was covered in that day, and whose shield the Lord of hosts was, did not fight for that liberty which he desired to withhold from others. The bread of oppression was not sweet to his taste, and he let the oppressed go free. He undid every burden. He provided lands and comfortable accommodations for them. When he kept this acceptable fast to the Lord, that those who had been slaves might rejoice in the day of their delivery. He who broke the yoke of British burdens off the neck of the people of this land, and who hailed his country's deliverer, by what name shall we call him, who secretly and almost unknown emancipated his bondsmen and bondswomen, became to them a father, and gave them inheritance. The name of Washington will live when the sculptured marble and statues of bronze shall be crumpled into dust. For it is the decree of the eternal God that the righteous shall be had in everlasting remembrance, but the memorial of the wicked shall rot. And then finally, if you could put up the final picture. This is a woman named Phyllis Wheatley, who was born a slave, who was freed by her owners. She lived in, I believe, Boston, Massachusetts, at least in Massachusetts, I believe Boston. And she became a poet. She actually was quite extraordinary. She was extremely well educated, even though she was born, well, actually, she was not born a slave. She was born in Africa and then was sold into slavery and brought to the United States, and was a slave in Massachusetts for a while, and then was freed by the people who bought her. But she was extremely well educated, and believe it or not, she learned not only French and other European languages, she actually was able to read both Greek and Latin. So again, extremely well educated. And she began writing poetry when she was a very young person. And she was the first African American to have her poetry published, both in Europe and in the United States. So in October of 1775, she wrote a poem to His Excellency George Washington. Now, remember, this is October 1775. This is while Washington's army is besieging the British army in Boston, right? This is, Lexington and Concord have happened. Washington has come up from Philadelphia to take command of the Revolutionary Army in Cambridge. And he has set up cannon and other things to besiege the British troops in Boston. And so he is the commander of the army fighting for independence. And Phyllis Wheatley writes him a poem, which she sends to him. And I'm not going to read the whole poem, but I'm going to read you a few stanzas. Celestial choir, enthroned in realms of light, Columbia's scenes of glorious toils I write. Famed for thy famed for thy valor, for thy virtues more. Hear every tongue thy guardian and implore. 1 century scarce performed its destined round, when Gallic powers Columbia's fury found, and so may you, who dares disgrace the land of freedom's heaven defended race. Fixed are the eyes of nations on the scales, for in their hopes Columbia's arm prevails. Anon, Britannia droops the pensive head, while round increase the rising hills of dead. Ah, cruel blindness to Columbia's state, lament thy thirst of boundless power too late. Proceed, great chief, with virtue on thy side. Thy every action let the goddess guide. A crown, a mansion, and a throne that shine, with gold unfading, Washington, be thine. So, I don't claim to be a great reader of poetry, but she wrote that and sent it to Washington. And believe it or not, Washington sent her a letter in reply. And I'm going to read you 2 paragraphs from that. He writes, to Miss Phyllis Wheatley, Cambridge, February 1776. Miss Phyllis, your favor of the 26th of October did not reach my hands till the middle of December. Time enough, you will say, to have given an answer ere this. Granted. But a variety of important occurrences continually interposing to distract the mind and withdraw the attention, I hope will apologize for the delay and plead my excuse for the seeming but not real neglect. I thank you most sincerely for your polite notice of me and the elegant lines you enclosed. And however undeserving I may be of such encomiums and panegyrics, the style and manner exhibit a striking proof of your poetical talents, in honor of which, and as a tribute justly due to you, I would have published the poem had I not been apprehensive that while I only meant to give the world this new instance of your genius, I might have incurred the imputation of vanity. This and nothing else determined me not to give it a place in public print. If you should ever come to Cambridge or near my headquarters, I shall be happy to see a person so favored by the muses, and to whom nature has been so liberal and beneficent in her dispensation. I am with great respect your obedient, humble servant, George Washington. So that's the end of the Washington's letter. You know, I have a lot more to say, but I'm not going to do it. Maybe some things will come up, important things to say. But I really, we've been through a lot over the last 10 weeks. And I really want to give people an opportunity to ask questions. So it may be a strange way to end this 10-part series, but I think I'm going to end it right there so that we can open it up for discussion. Okay?